President Cyril Ramaphosa has for the first time openly spoken out on the motives of the public protector in her investigation into the CR17 campaign. Of course, this investigation started with the revelations that in Parliament, 500,000 rands was actually given to the president from the embattled Busasa. And the whole question was around whether or not the president deliberately misled Parliament. It emerged then from that investigation that emails were uncovered as well as bank statements. And the president says this is information that really had nothing to do with the initial investigation. It was quite gratuitous, but also it points to a political motive which would quite be detrimental for him politically. Our current Mon is in now to help us just to understand what the president is saying here. Karen, it's good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So previously, the president tried to steer clear of attacking the public protector's motives. He would really speak about what the courts have been saying, her inability to interpret the law, her grasp of the law. But in this affidavit, he's going directly to say, literally, this investigation was politically motivated.
Well, he's saying she had an ulterior purpose, specifically including the bank statements and the FIC, the Financial Intelligence Center report that dealt with certain bank account information as part of her so-called Rule 53 record of evidence that she says she considered in reaching the very politically explosive findings that she did make against the president. And he's saying essentially she did this because there's no link between that information and her findings. He said, why was this even included? Like, what is the relevance of this to the investigation? He also says that the three very serious findings made against him, that, you know, suspicions of money laundering are substantiated, that there's an improper relationship between his family and African Global Operations, which was formerly Busasa, that he lied to Parliament, are simply not substantiated by any of the evidence that she's produced in the so-called Rule 53 record, which we now know is under lock and key. We don't have access to it, that actually supports any of her findings. And he's saying also that he suspects that the emails that she's utilized, which of course made their way into the media, which, you know, have been used in media reports to suggest that he wasn't as ignorant of the campaign kind of funding situation as he claims to be. Yes. He maintains that that is the case in this affidavit. He says, well, you know, these were potentially stolen. He said, how were these accessed?
But
and he's actually said it's a very serious allegation.
A crime was committed.
And he says, you need to tell us where you got these emails from. You need to disclose. So, you know, this really is painting her in a corner, specifically because he's also said to the Financial Intelligence Center that it was unlawful for Busisiwe Mkhwebane to use the FIC report, which the FIC itself said was intelligence, not evidence, as part of the body of evidence that she used in her report. And his lawyers asking the FIC to say when they're going to lay criminal charges against her. So the gloves really have come off in the last few days.
This is, of course, damaging for the president in a sense because, again, it would seem for those who are his detractors that the president is attacking the office of the public protector for her just merely doing her job.
Well, you know, that I think will be her argument in response. We saw that she responded very angrily to Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan, who has repeatedly stated that he believes the public protector's investigations against him, be it into the SARS matter, the Ivan Pillay early retirement, rogue unit, etc., were improperly motivated. And essentially, she was part of a fight back campaign launched by the people who were implicitly involved in state capture and were resisting the attempts to clean up government. The president hasn't gone that far, but what he has said is that based on the evidence that he sees that she's used to justify her report, and a number of other things, including her, he says, misrepresenting the fact that Gavin Watson was actually very willing to give an interview to his lawyers, that she, you know, created a false impression that he wasn't willing to do so, that she misrepresented her investigation to the CR17 campaign managers, to himself, that these emails were potentially stolen, that there was no reason to include these bank statements, that this was gratuitous, an potential attempt to put public or private information into the public domain. He's really saying that he's making those conjectures on the basis of evidence. We now have a situation where the public protector needs to respond to that evidence on affidavit. But it's also important to remember that even at the height of the animosity that existed, certainly from then President Jacob Zuma towards Public Protector Thuli Madonsela, he never accused her of having an improper motive in pursuing an investigation. So certainly, yes, we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis. It's one that's shrouded the office of the Public Protector, the office of the President. It is affecting the judiciary because courts that have ruled against the Public Protector have been accused by parties like the EFF of, being politically controlled. And we saw the CJ, Chief Justice Mkhwebane having that absolutely, explosive press conference to say this is simply untenable. And, we are in the midst of a crisis and something is going to have to give at some point.
Well, I mean, we're already in a constitutional crisis here with the president who, according to the Public Protector, deliberately misled Parliament. And that's really the big issue that the president is dealing with. I don't know how much is this revelation of political motive is going to assist in the courts overturning that report of the Public Protector.
Well, his argument is simple. He says, I was responding to a question by Mmusi Maimane that was essentially first about VBS. He then asked me a follow-up question about, a payment that was made to my son's account. I interpreted that as being, it wasn't identified as a campaign account at that stage. I knew my son was in business with Bosasa, and I immediately off the cuff responded to this and said, well, there was this consultancy agreement. Yes. Afterwards, I then find out that, in fact, they were talking about the campaign finances. It was Mmusi Maimane who misled Parliament because he gave incorrect information about the accounts. I was simply responding to the question that he asked, and there is no evidence that the Public Protector has produced that showed that I deliberately lied. I corrected my mistake almost immediately after that. I mean, obviously the court will have to wade through that, and when the Public Protector responds to this, which she will do in the next few weeks, she's going to have to say, well, this is why I believe you deliberately lied to Parliament, which is of course a very serious offence, which if found to be the case, carries a potential prison sentence with it.
She has always said, look, I've got evidence to support my findings, and I will present that evidence to support my findings in time as we get into the case in the courts, which is now under review. Is this evidence enough to strengthen her case of her findings of the president deliberately misleading Parliament? I mean, she even said, look, the president didn't have to answer at that point. He actually could have gone back and said, I'm just going to go and apply my mind. I'll come back with a proper response. There was nothing present the president to give that answer at that time.
That is her argument. And, we have had a previous situation with the former Public Protector, Thuli Madonsela, where Jacob Zuma obviously went to Parliament and said that it was completely untrue that any part of Nkandla had been paid for. He said, I built my homes myself, the taxpayer, there was no state money spent on it. Of course, then, subsequently she found that the visitor centre, cattle kraal, and a number of buildings, swimming pool, etc., had been built at the taxpayer expense. But she said, look, I can't say that he did this deliberately. He may have been, there may have been room for error on his part. So certainly there was a reluctance by Thuli Madonsela to make that finding against former President Jacob Zuma. She has produced a Rule 53 record, which is the evidence that she considered in making her decision. And President Ramaphosa's conjecture is simply like, well, there's no evidence to show that I deliberately lied. Now she has to respond to that, and the courts will have to wade through this. But either way, there's going to be blood in the water. Damage is going to be done to all the institutions involved in this. And it's really unfortunate that this is, at this stage of our democracy, with the kind of crises that South Africa is dealing with, a body that is ultimately meant to be the profound watchdog for society is at loggerheads with the ultimate first citizen of the country, the head of state. Yeah. And it's not good for anyone.
Politically damaging, I suppose, for the president within his party, certainly, but damaging for the Public Protector as well to an extent.
Yes, and remember, she's also filed this attempt to seek to appeal the personal cost order granted against her in the Estina matter, where the court made probably, I would argue, the most scathing judgment against her by saying that she'd failed the people of South Africa in the way she conducted that inept investigation, and that she should personally be liable for 7.5% of the cost, making a number of findings about her competence, about her failure to really do her job, show appreciation for the Constitution, etc., 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 that may form very powerful ammunition to those seeking to remove her. There is the very distinct possibility of a parliamentary process going on before her. So, you know, all of these officers are in a state of crisis over this, and this matter, which carries so much political significance, to have the head of state essentially saying that this entire thing was improperly motivated and questioning the very basis for her doing it, is also not something that I don't think she would want either.
Of course, President saying not one, as you mentioned, Karen, of the findings against him show that he deliberately lied to Parliament about the 500,000 rands donation, which we know now he has admitted to have received from the deceased Bosasa boss, Gavin Watson. Do we know at this particular point what has happened to that 500,000?
You know, there was a discussion at the time that it had been returned. And that seemed to be, you know, that hasn't been mentioned at all in this court application thus far. What's very interesting as well is that the president also has made an issue of the fact that his lawyers wanted to cross-examine Gavin Watson. And he was not, you know, the public protector said, well, you can send questions and I will send them to them. And then Gavin Watson subsequently responded. The president is suggesting that it's clear from letters from Gavin Watson's lawyers that he was more than willing to give an interview to the president's lawyers. And he's accused the public protector of creating what he says is a false impression that Watson was reluctant to give an interview. Of course, Gavin Watson recently deceased in a very strange and inexplicable car accident. But certainly a suggestion from the president that there was an untoward motive from the public protector in refusing his lawyers that opportunity, and of course the public protector will have to address that. She did also refuse the president the right to cross-examine Mmusi Maimane on this key issue of whether in fact he was guilty of misleading Parliament because he allegedly gave incorrect information around that count. So this whole matter really just a hot mess.
It's going to get really heated. Much appreciated, Karen. Thanks for coming through. That is Karen Moore, of course, bringing that story for us. She's our special editorial correspondent here at Newsroom Africa, Channel 405.